If it's Mondays, it's with Mike. Our next issue is the January 29th Washington, D.C. crash of an American Eagle passenger jet and an Army Black Hawk helicopter. On January 29, 2025, a passenger jet collided with a Black Hawk helicopter in the airspace of Washington, D.C. There were questions about short, albeit procedurally permissible, staffing on air traffic controllers that evening. For more information on the facts and events, please watch the NBC Nightly News broadcast from January 30th, listed at the Mondays with Mike podcast website. Like, dozens of people died, a huge tragedy. Do you think this is symptomatic of a systemic aviation crisis occurring in this country in AD 2025?
So already from the news reports, it came out that while it was acceptable to only have one controller, usually you have at least two controllers, one directing plane traffic, one directing helicopter traffic. Apparently in this case, it's been reported in the news that they just had one. And when seconds matter, if you match the time from when the controller talked to the helicopter pilot to the time that the helicopter and the plane collided, it's not a whole lot of time to react. And you would expect in the most congested, high volume places in the country that air traffic controllers are needed, that they would have a not just acceptable, but an optimal number of air traffic controllers directing traffic because of the fact that there is so much of it. And so it is symptomatic of something going on. But the reason I think this story was important for our current administration and the current political climate is that the messaging from the administration is all wrong for the moment. The FAA administrator resigned, days into either the day before or days into the start of the administration and wasn't replaced with an acting administrator. So there was just no one running the FAA. They have a hierarchy of people like who run it, but there was no one that the top end of the administration said, you have authority to do the job of administrator of the FAA. And so having that kind of ad hoc approach to safety, not great. But then there's the other messaging coming from the administration that's really terrible right now when you make a press conference saying, oh, we want the best and the brightest and the most skilled in the positions that affect public safety, and you have executive orders that institute a government-wide hiring freeze, and you have emails going out saying anybody who wants to leave and jump ship and go out the door will pay you money, real money, to just leave, to go away and resign your job. Well, that sends a terrible message that, hey, everybody who's qualified and skilled and could do this job, you should apply to work for the federal government. But by the way, all the people we already had go through this onerous, complicated, time consuming process to apply for the jobs in the federal government, we're showing them the door and we're trying to reduce the workforce by whatever percent they hope they can get. Sends an awful message. It's completely inconsistent. And lest we forget, the government also sent out this memo that shut down almost all federal grants and loans. And you would think, wait a second, don't federal grants and loans apply to any number of programs that study or investigate or learn about air traffic and air safety and public safety? What's going on here? Why did they just shut down all the money? It seems poorly thought out. It seems like we're in a strange era of not even looking before you leap, just leaping and then let's see what happens when you just turn the switch off of all the funding. That's not great. That's not a good idea. We get just terrible consequences that happen, and they don't have to happen. They're predictable. There's no reason that the helicopter needed to be at the altitude that it was when the limit of altitude is 200 feet, and it apparently was at 300 something feet. Why was there? Why weren't the alarm bells ringing just nonstop the second it went over 200 feet? Who was there to say don't do that? Who ultimately has responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen? And if there is no one at the top of the chain saying, oh, it's my job to do it or it's my responsibility, it's a bad time right now for aviation safety in this country. Apparently, Trump fired some group that does aviation security within the first week of government. The people whose jobs were just to look at aviation security, a whole bunch of them don't have it anymore. Sorry for going on what sounds like a rant.
No. It's very interesting. It's called Mondays with Mike.
It is deeply unpleasant to see this moment for the president to say, without evidence, really, without even an investigation, that the reason this happened was a DEI hiring.
On January 30, in the same broadcast as the last excerpt, NBC News reported the following. Lester Holt, back now with a new backlash after President Trump asserted today, without providing evidence, that Democrats' diversity programs may have played a role in the mid-air crash. Garrett Haake with that story. Garrett Haake says, tonight in a White House news conference that began with a somber moment of silence, President Trump, pivoting from prayer, Trump says, I speak to you this morning in an hour of anguish for our nation. Haake, to politics. Trump, I put safety first. Obama, Biden, and the Democrats put policy first. Haake, suggesting, without giving evidence, that Democrats' DEI policies at the FAA and military, which President Trump ended last week with an executive order, may have contributed to the mid-air collision. Trump, we have to have our smartest people. It doesn't matter what they look like, how they speak. What matters? Intellect, talent. The story continues. It's linked at the Mondays with Mike website.
I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense. You don't arrive at a conclusion that something happened without doing a thorough investigation and ruling out every possibility. Because, frankly, it was frustrating also that he arrived at a conclusion without even considering the possibility of a national security threat. Could somebody have hacked the helicopter, frozen the controls, frozen the vision, done something that made it impossible for the pilot to react in time or to see in time? We don't know. And you don't know without an investigation. And if you've already arrived at a conclusion without investigating all of the possibilities, then it diminishes the importance of truth, of facts, of just acknowledging that reality is complicated and it's not so simple as, the hiring practices led to this result. Says who? It was not just racist, also sexist in the sense that if it was a female pilot, but also some of that language that was being talked about of like a higher level of intelligence or a high level of capability or high level of psychological, all that stuff just like carries with it certain assumptions that are just terrible assumptions to have because they don't reflect reality.
Yeah, the stuff about DEI, it struck me as pretty tone deaf, especially when you consider that there's a shortage of about 3,000 air traffic controllers nationwide. I don't know if that directly translates to everybody who applies for the job and is qualified gets the job, but it's sort of like we need more air traffic controllers, not less. And if I was like 18, 19, 20, and I was good at like reflex video games, which I am not, and didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and if I was cool under pressure, I would really consider air traffic controller. Those people are heroes. They are. And I'm not exaggerating, they're heroes, because they make the skies safe. There's an analogy. If a loved one of yours suffers from a medical emergency in a public place, you might hear, is there a doctor in the house? And that's an urgent call. And the doctor is bound to respond and to assist and to render aid. Now, because there is that norm, there is the utmost social obligation upon medical schools, upon doctors themselves and medical students to attain a high standard that anyone, any doctor, who responds to the call shall render aid and well. And in the same way, we have been told for years, and I'm sure it remains true, that air travel is statistically the safest form of travel. And I know pilots and they're calm under pressure, but lately, I've just thought that the airways are not as safe as they once have been. And I hope we'll invest and do practical things and fully staff air traffic control. 3,000, how about 30,000? Get them at full staffing, 24/7.
If they know there's a problem that has a solution that is predictable that they've known about for a very long time, it behooves the powers that be to actually work to solve the problem as opposed to make the problem worse. And in this case, with air traffic controllers, it's very clear that no matter how qualified someone is, no matter how smart they are, no matter how much training they get, you can only work people so much before fatigue and exhaustion sets in. And if there's no one there to replace them at the time that they have to go to sleep, then there is the potential for reduced safety. The other issue, there are very strict age requirements for hiring air traffic controllers. My understanding is that you have to be either 30 or 31 at the time you apply to be hired, which means that they rule out virtually everyone over the age of 31 to apply to be an air traffic controller.
You have to be 30 or 31 and under, you mean?
And under, yes, you have to
Okay.
be between, I think, the ages of 18 and 30 or 31 to apply to do the training to become hired to be an air traffic controller, which means that it severely limits the potential labor force and pool of labor even available to do the job, to train for the job. And so the question I have is how much effort is there in high schools, in education, in every avenue to talk to this demographic group to actually hire people or train people to do these jobs? I mean, do the potential workers have to find out all the information on their own, or are there any efforts being made to educate younger people? And if there aren't, why not? Why aren't there more efforts to educate people or to recruit people out of high school or in college for mathematics or whatever they're looking for these jobs in particular? There are very stringent requirements of who to hire. It is just like this impossible puzzle. It doesn't help that I think was it Reagan who fired all the air traffic controllers?
I believe that was it. Yeah.
That sent just the worst message to unionized labor. They're still trying to recover from that in terms of hiring because if you don't have a sense of job security for a job, right, that's very stressful, that's very difficult. Someone might not want to do a job if they don't think they'll be able to keep the job, if it just looks so difficult to get it. In terms of why this was an important story, there's almost 1 billion people fly on planes in the U.S. every year. 4.5 billion fly around the world. There are economic implications. If it looks like the U.S. isn't taking the investigation seriously, when the Malaysia flight 370 disappeared, there was a massive boycott on Malaysia from Chinese tourists, cost them billions of dollars in Malaysia. We don't want to have something similar in the U.S. of a boycott on air travel because tourism is 3% of the U.S. GDP, right? It's a lot of money. It's trillions of dollars. And a reduction in tourism of people just deciding I don't want to fly because there's this perception that maybe the people running the show aren't hiring air traffic controllers as seriously as perhaps they could because of some weird prejudice against DEI. Huge economic implications, right? There's just no way around it. If people are scared to fly, they're going to use something else, like driving in a car or bus or a train. That's less tourism. That's less money. So that's my thought, is that perception is everything. And in this case, it looks really bad in the first 2 weeks of the Trump administration that there's one of the deadliest air crash disasters in, I think it's 15 years.
Yeah, and more deadly than the one in 2009.
Sure. Also, there was another crash almost immediately after. It wasn't as big, but it's still, there's just another one that just happened with the medevac that crashed straight into a bunch of homes and set them on fire. Like, not good. It doesn't look good.
Yeah.
Here concludes our exciting discussion concerning DOJ, USAID, and the alleged constitutional crisis.
We don't have a king. Executive does not control all three branches of government. They're supposed to check each other. And if those checks don't work, then we have what's called a constitutional crisis.
I recall another nugget from American history class. Andrew Jackson did something against what the Supreme Court said, and John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time. Andrew Jackson said something like, Marshall has made his ruling, let him enforce it. And I'm sort of thinking, okay, the executive is in charge of enforcing the laws. However, if the executive ought not and does not have discretion over funds. Perhaps we should modify the government through legal means so that Congress has agents who will distribute the funds, not the president. That would be like a constitutional amendment thing that I had an idea for. Because I'm thinking about this Supreme Court ruling that the president has legal immunity from a lot of stuff. Like qualified immunity, I don't think it's from everything, but in an official capacity, a lot of stuff. And me 10 years ago would have said something like, well, the person on the top, they have to sort of be in the driver's seat, and it makes sense in the abstract, or it made sense in the abstract to me. But if we're reaching a point where the authorities of the different branches of government are clashing, perhaps we need a constitutional amendment to revise the immunity decision, or something like that. If we are reaching a constitutional crisis, maybe we need to sort of think about the kind of country we want to be. You know, a country of rule by the many or rule by the one, and sort all these things out in the coming years or decades, and it would probably take a long time. Do you think a constitutional amendment may be required?
I think Biden was proposing something along those lines as he was out the door. He was sending all these warning signs of how there need to be restrictions on the ethics for the Supreme Court, how we need to have term limits for the Supreme Court, how we should have some kind of limits on presidential power that are explicitly written in law so that they can't just wave a wand and say everything's an official act, I'm immune. But you're right, that would take a very long time, and it's not clear that it would even be enforced, right? Because the president is the one that enforces stuff. So about the John Marshall thing, that's the whole dilemma right now. It sure looks like Trump is testing the limits of what the executive can do, trying to freeze all foreign aid, all government, domestic grants and loans. Those are huge, sweeping orders that are unprecedented with respect to what's happened in history. And so it's not clear the extent to which he can do these orders. It is clear that the judiciary is trying to stop some of it. So the huge freeze on grants and loans, there's still an administrative stay on that going forward, and it's been renewed. Where the system doesn't hold is if the Trump administration tries to go forward anyways with those freeze on grants and loans, even with the judicial court order saying no. And that's one of the issues with Musk having access to the payment system, is that they could have instituted some kind of mechanism that we don't know about with no oversight if they locked everyone out of the systems that could just, at the press of a button, stop huge amounts of money, of grants and loans being honored by people who had to apply for those grants and loans and were told that they would be given those things. It's also an issue, though, of the power of the US dollar. So if you ever get any of the dollar bills or currency and look at it, this is for all debts.
This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, I believe.
It's really a big question. Those grants and loans and that foreign aid could all be considered a kind of debt, especially in foreign aid. If somebody bought up all the stuff that they were told to do for like a contractor or something, hired employees, did infrastructure, paying rent on something, those could all be considered legally binding debts if contracts were signed. And just uniformly, like categorically across the board, stopping all of that money really diminishes the power of the US dollar in terms of whether the government will keep its word. And that's scary. For anything of this magnitude, it's important that they are following the law in all respects, because why would anyone want to do business with the US government in the future if every 4 years the new president could just, with one sentence on a piece of paper, stop all agreed upon contracts? People agree to do work because they're told they will be paid. So it's really complicated. It's not clear that this can even happen, but that it is happening is concerning because the checks that were supposed to be in place to stop it from happening immediately clearly didn't hold, right? They didn't work. The fact that there's supposed to be a notice period, that they're supposed to, for example, the inspectors generals, when they were fired, they were supposed to be a 30-day notice given to Congress justifying why those independent inspector generals were fired. And those inspector generals are the oversight in a lot of cases in the federal government for seeing whether the laws are being faithfully executed and faithfully enforced based on how they're written. That was their job. Is the money going where it's supposed to be going? Are the agreements being honored? All that stuff, right? And at the end of the day, what we see out in the world, what we would consider the civilized world, is undergirded. The backstop is the US dollar as a reserve currency. The dollar is one of the strongest forms of currency, cash, credit, you name it, in terms of how people transact commerce. If the faith of that is questioned or diminished to such a degree, I mean, we're not talking about a recession. We're talking about a depression on a big scale.
Yeah, we're just in, there be dragons territory. What's it called? The Latin phrase terra incognita?
Yeah. We're wading into the unknown, the fog of war, terra incognita.
A fog of war, that's the term. I think that this can be summarized by the president. He is not following the procedures that Congress has set down in law. But the Supreme Court has said that he has some degree of immunity. Uh-oh. This seems like there are some untied knots around here somewhere. One, would you say that's a fair summary? And two, do you want to say anything about what USAID does?
Sure, that is a fair summary, that the president's testing the limits of executive power in a way that hasn't been seen in quite some time. And two, what USAID does is that it generates goodwill around the world for the United States, but also it is one of the largest humanitarian organizations on the planet in terms of providing food to starving people around the world, but also in terms of providing life-saving medicine to many, many people around the world. And stopping all that funding all at once can lead to pretty devastating consequences, because food has a shelf life. And so if it rots in the ports, the starving people aren't getting the food. And so starving people will starve if they're not receiving the food that they're getting. But also medicine, right? Life-saving medicine is a big deal. If someone's on a regimen of medicine that they have to take medicine at a certain time, and if they're not receiving all that medicine, there are consequences. USAID was one of the mechanisms by which a lot of diseases and the spread of disease are stopped around the world and reduced and mitigated. It's a big deal, but it's also for all of these natural disasters you see around the world, all these war zones, all these conflicts, USAID is the one that helps navigate infrastructure repair. It helps coordinate humanitarian aid, medical aid. It helps many different organizations successfully rebuild places that have been destroyed. The absence of USAID means that either some other organization will fill that void, or no organization will fill that void, which leads to more conflict and more chaos around the world. And so USAID was for stability around the world, and its absence is going to be felt significantly.
Yeah. And Nixon opened China to trade. And one of his theories behind that was, if people in the world trade with other people in the world, then they will be more value to each other alive than dead. And that will really change things. And I think Nixon, or whoever holds that idea, has got the right idea. So I think that USAID does very important work. And here's another thing. I have various ideas for how we might construct society differently than we currently do. And I was thinking of a very non-controversial one. Here's one that is probably okay. I don't think speed limits should be so strict. However, like they do in Germany. However, I would not just yank out the speed limits from where they are currently, because people are used to them. People expect them. You have to, even if you want to make a change, if you're going to do it well, it's better to do it gradually so that people don't get hurt on the way. So when the NBC reporter asked the question, are people going to lose their lives over this? People have already lost their lives over this, responded the doctor. On February 3rd, on NBC Nightly News, NBC News correspondent Kelly O'Donnell said, U.S. aid workers told to stay home as many relief programs are halted. And then she interviews former U.S. aid worker Dr. Atul Gawande, and she asks him, are lives on the line because of this? He replies, lives have already been lost because of this. The whole report is linked at the Mondays with Mike website. And I just shook my head and it gives me chills. And it reminds me of the quote, these violent delights have violent ends. If they want to reform things, okay. But for God's sake, we gotta do it gradually and in a calm and directed fashion.
So if the money's already been spent and the process is already going for sending food, medicine, etc., and it's already ongoing, stopping it mid-transit is terrible. If they wanted to stop funding, it should have been future funding that didn't have a direct, measurable impact on ongoing projects. The fact that it was done in an ad hoc manner, meaning that they just did a blanket freeze on all aid all at once, was terrible, right? Because it has consequences that people couldn't react in time to. If you give people a lag time or notice or at least some ability to mitigate the consequences, then there would have been less devastating consequences. The issue with what happened now is they whine about, government waste, fraud, abuse, but this is a huge amount of waste to have so much food rotting in ports or so much medicine not getting to the people that they said it was already going to go to, because that all that stuff costs money to get and make, right? So it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, the waste of life is much worse than the waste of money.
It can't be reversed, and they just did it in a terrible way. It just looks very bad.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time. Thank you for taking the time out of your day.
Sure. I like to talk.
Yeah. And hopefully our viewers like to listen, yeah. Right. If it's Mondays, it's with Mike.